My name is Austin Williams. I'm the director of the Future Cities Project, and I'm chairing. And we have speakers from around the world and also guests and people listening in. So thank you very much for that. We'll try and have this as a broad-ranging conversation as possible, and feel free to kind of chip in the conversation at the end. There's a donate button on our website, which should be coming up on the chat function now. I have to raise it. I mean, you're all staying at home now. You have phenomenal disposable income. So please just visit our website, click on donate, and give us the price of a cup of coffee or a ticket that you would have normally given to an event. That would be very, very useful to keep us doing this stuff. And then finally, public service announcement. You do not have to wear a face mask for this event, but please don't cough near the microphone. There are vulnerable people in the room. So look, the question about why we're having this debate, I mean, in some ways self-evident, but given the fact that cities have been locked down for 5 or 6 months, some of them kind of partial, like Stockholm, some of them an absolute complete shutdown, like Wuhan, and some of these lockdown measures have been eased. When I went to London city centre just last week, it was almost like going to a scene from a zombie movie. There's, rather than a national capital, there is a strangeness about city centres and city life and city discussion these days. Public transport has collapsed in some respects, or at least is kind of not functioning as well as it ought. UK theatres and museums yesterday had a national protest about the decimation of the cultural sector. The city centre shops are being boarded up, and universities continue to teach from home. And these things have consequences for cities. There's a lot of discussion about corporate staff never returning to their high-tech glass and steel office blocks, and people working from home. So what are these kind of, what's the result of this leaving of the city, the exit from the city? That said, obviously urban centres have always faced areas of deprivation and dereliction. So we might be witnessing the same kind of cyclical process that we might have done historically, so we can discuss that. Is this new, or is this just something which is a regular feature? And the UK government, for those people outside the UK government has just relaxed planning policies on conversions of offices into homes. So are we going to see the reinvigoration of the city centre with residents rather than commuters? So there's a kind of a bleakness to this narrative, I appreciate, but the positive spin for some people is that we have cleaner, greener cities and quieter cities than ever before. You know, who needs the New York High Line when you actually have the entire city of London seems to be taken over by nature? So the question is coronavirus a threat to the city, or is it an opportunity? That's how we can polarize it, but there's more nuance than just that. For it to be an opportunity, I think we have to address the sense of the city as a toxic place. One commentator just wrote, we read an article yesterday, that the city, the crowded spaces have become synonymous with danger and persistent fears of contagion, which is not really what you'd want in a thriving, dynamic city. So, if we continue to see people and density, public space as a potential threat, what's the potential for a city? With the shrinking of urban centres, what are the implications for urbanism and also for a productive economy? And what does this 6 months of isolation that we've all encountered, what does that mean for a sense of the social, what a city really is, about people moving, getting along together? So those are just a couple of my questions. You can ignore them or take them on board. We're not here to debate the merits of the coronavirus science. We're just trying to address what a city is, what it's for, and what it represents. So let me go through the speakers. And this will be in the order in which they speak, and they're being asked to speak for just 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation to give them more time. First up, we have Joel Kotkin, who's Presidential Fellow in Urban Futures at Chapman University in Orange, California. He was described by the New York Times as America's Uber geographer, which for any young people here doesn't mean he draws maps of cheap taxi routes. It means he's top of the profession. He's the author of The Human City, Urbanism for the Rest of Us, and his latest book is called The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, A Warning to the Global Middle Class, published just a couple of months ago, and it will become a Future Cities Project Readers Group book in a couple of months' time. Next up, we'll have Vicki Richardson, who is writer and curator of architecture and design and the co-founder of the Lantau UK Fellowship. She's visiting lecturer at the Royal College of Art Interior Design course, and she's formerly the director of Architecture, Design and Fashion at the British Council. She has been named in Debrett's as one of the most influential people in British architecture. Then we'll have Martin Powell, he's been misnamed in the blurb. He's actually the Chief Sustainability Officer at Siemens, where he is leading the charge for global carbon neutrality by 2030, but he was the global head of urban development at Siemens, working to encourage the digitalization of cities and working closely with about 100 cities to help their environmental targets. Martin was also Boris Johnson's Deputy Mayor of London for Energy and the Environment, but we don't talk about that. Sylvia Chan is Research Editor at OMA, Office for Metropolitan Architecture in Rotterdam, and previously she was Adjunct Lecturer at the University of Hong Kong and Hong Kong Design Institute. She wrote a great book called Writing into Architecture, China's Architectural Design and Construction since 1949, well worth reading, exploring the history of architectural journalism in post-war China. And then finally, last but not least, we have Tim Abrams, architecture critic with the Architecture Record. He's a consultant editor with Domus and Plan Design magazine. He writes the Economist, Icon, and lots of others. And he lives, rather than studies, in Oxford. He's also the founder of Machine Books. So there you go. It's quite a panel, I have to say. And we're very grateful to have Joel speaking to us from California, and Sylvia is in Rotterdam at the moment. So we will welcome those as we go along. But first up, can I ask Joel, if you would please, just to give us your 4 to 5 minutes immediate thoughts, if you would.
Okay, well, thank you, Austin. Let me just try to go through this fairly quickly. Is COVID the end of cities? No, cities have written urban histories. They come back, but I think they're going to have to change. I think the idea that, well, everything will go back to normal, and the way, this wonderful urban future that people like to talk about, I think it's going to have to adjust and change. The key thing to think of, and in the US and other countries, US and Australia I've done the most in, is that people were already moving out of the cities, out of the big cities beforehand. New York, Chicago, Los Angeles are all losing population last 2-3 years. Migration is actually moving, A, to suburbs, B, to smaller cities. Now, one advantage the United States has, and I think Germany has some of the same things, is where we have many urban centers, which may not be as dense, for instance, as New York City. In terms of COVID, certainly the numbers, we've crunched them as much as we can. Basically, high density areas are about 3 to 4 times higher rate of fatalities. There are places in the countryside that have been hit, Native American reservations, for instance, some places where there are meatpacking plants. But basically, if you're in a place like New York, your chances of dying from COVID have been a lot higher. And although there have been other cases, the really scary part of it has been the disproportionate impact on poor people. If you look at New York, it's not just density, how many people per square mile, but how do people live? What my colleague Wendell Cox calls exposure density. So you have much higher death rates, let's say in parts of East Brooklyn, which is where my mother is from originally, or from parts of Queens, just because people are living in crowded housing. We're seeing this in Southern California, where the highest rates are overwhelmingly in areas where there's crowded housing. So a lot of the problems that already existed have just simply been made worse. Also, it's been very, very hard on small business, particularly ethnic small business, who have a very hard time competing with chains and with Amazon. So I think that the problems of cities have been exacerbated by COVID, but I don't think they will necessarily be defined by them. I do want to just mention on top of that, now this is maybe more of a concern here in the United States, is the recent unrest in the cities. That may actually be more important. One of the problems of the urban renaissance, if you want to use that terminology, has been that it has also fostered tremendous levels of inequality. There was a sort of a sore that was there already. The Floyd case sort of exploded it. And now I think, for instance, if you look at what's happening in Chicago, which I think has the most beautiful downtown in the world. It's just getting trashed. I think it's going to be very hard to convince people to move to Seattle or Portland. And there are already signs of people moving into the suburbs. So I think that the social crisis of cities is at least as big a problem long-term as COVID. What are the opportunities? One, if rents drop, maybe young people who are the one group who really like living in cities in large numbers, maybe they can come back. Maybe the price constraints will go away. Cities are going to have to redefine themselves. Online work is going to go, estimates from Stanford are about 6% before to about 20. That's going to really have an impact on how companies are run. I think cities have to focus on being nice places to live instead of forcing people to live in ways that they maybe don't want to live in order to have economic opportunity. I think what we can talk about is decentralizing city economies. As my family being originally from Brooklyn, there used to be a real Brooklyn economy. It now has become kind of a commuter suburb for New York City. Yet a lot of the talent is in Brooklyn. Why not develop business in Brooklyn so people don't have to take the subway? They can ride their bike, they could drive their car, they could walk. So I think an opportunity to decentralize cities. And lastly, I think we're going to look at the cities coming back in the form that H.G. Wells talked about about 120 years ago. And what Wells talked about is that the urban core will become a place of concourse and rendezvous. It has things that the suburbs and surrounding areas will never have, but it will attract predominantly people without children, and he put it, be a place of elegant extinction. So I think the city will continue to play a role. It will not be the dominant center that has been talked about. I think we're going to see more dispersion to smaller cities and increased suburbanization. But that does not mean that cities will be wiped out. I think what are cities for? To make life better. If cities are a little less crowded, they'll be healthier and better places to live. One quick, just a little statistic. In 1920, right after the Spanish flu, Manhattan had 2.5 million people. By 1950, it had 1.5 million people. It was probably the most important city in the world, perhaps in history, was New York in 1950. So I think you can make changes and still keep cities as important. But if you don't make changes, then you're going to have some very serious issues. I think this idea that you can go on and this is just a little interruption and everything will be hunky-dory after, I think is misplaced and the worst thing that city leaders can do.
Perfect, Joel. Thank you very much indeed. I would normally come back and ask you a question, but I think I'll go through the full range of people and then we'll have a little bit of a conversation. So thank you very much for that. Very useful start. Okay, Vicki, please.
So what's the city for? Well, it's a simple question and it's difficult to come up with an answer that doesn't sound banal, but I would just say simply cities are for people. And in most cases, people build cities and run them regardless of what planners, designers and politicians say. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves of that, given the climate we live in, which has accepted unprecedented levels of top-down political control, almost to the point where it's that you might imagine that we can't do anything in our lives in the city without getting permission to do it. I've sneaked in a photograph behind me, even though Austin said no PowerPoints. And this is London's Regent Street in April. I took my daily exercise to cycle into central London, which was a really haunting experience to see the city devoid of people and traffic. And it made me realize that even from just a design point of view, the city doesn't make any sense without people. And yet many of the leading sort of urbanists and architects have spoken recently about how they prefer the city in this kind of state. And most of the policies that are being, and changes that are being put forward seems seem kind of to take their energy from the idea that the city has actually been better during lockdown, where we've seen, you know, a return to local sort of village life, even in London, decreased access by vehicles to the city centre and reduced traffic. Regent Street was first imagined in the late 18th century by John Gwynne, who initiated the idea of improvement of the city, meaning acts for lighting and pavement in the 1760s, and strategic planning for the whole city, and the beginnings of the idea of public space and public buildings. But despite these kind of public acts and plans being backed by the king, most of Georgian London, most of the city is London city as we know it today, was built by private clients, developers, and private buildings responding to the push for expansion and improvement. And the main point I want to make is that the pandemic has revealed actually a deep-seated antipathy for cities, coming from urbanists, policymakers, politicians. The very people who should be leading change and imagining the future city seem to actually be ambivalent about growth and development and all of those things that you know really led the development of the city as we know it today. And COVID has rightly led to a desire for change and improvement, and cities have always developed as a result of push and pull and various disasters which led to responses and improvement, whether you think of the Abercrombie plan or Bazalgette's sewer in London and the embankment. Yet the government's response, the British government's response of build, 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 seems to have no sense of vision for the UK's cities, and either for building new cities or for extending and developing existing ones. The measures and responses that have been discussed are rarely to improve access, infrastructure, or amenities, but the reverse. Really, they've talked about lifestyle changes, including cycling, strengthening of communities through volunteering, and actually a weakening of a sense of democracy in the planning process, as measures such as pavement widening and cycling lanes are pushed through quickly before anyone has a chance to oppose them. And the idea of cycling infrastructure is a real misnomer, because it actually means taking space, just reallocating space in existing roads rather than building anything new. I think the other thing that's really suffered as a result of the pandemic, which will weaken our ability to develop cities, and particularly London, is the idea of who we are as a sense of the public, as citizens. And I feel that as partly as a result of the lost freedoms, but also of the result that initiative has been taken away from us as citizens and individuals, and that we've been simply, the most we can do in this situation is to stay at home. In the past, London's been a place of freedom, and that's why it's thrived. And most of the Georgian city was built by private money, as I said, and people came to London to find freedom from censorship and political oppression elsewhere in the world. This year, with my RCA students, I've been looking at the Mayor's London plan and the emphasis it places on public space, the extension of the idea of the public realm to interior public spaces, such as shopping malls and museums, which at first glance seems to be a humanist, liberating impulse. But I think during the pandemic, it's been revealed that the emphasis on public space is actually almost the opposite. And the response to COVID has been to stand public and private on its head. So the kind of restrictions that we accept in public interiors, such as airports, are now imposed on traditional public spaces. The imposition of controls of spaces with signs, barriers, one-way systems, the leading parks that we saw during the height of the lockdown. So despite the constant use of the term public space in virtually every discussion about the city, I think there's actually been incredibly little opposition to any of these measures, and nobody has really questioned the idea that we need to make sacrifices to our freedoms in order to deal with the pandemic. I think that if urbanists and architects really cared about public space, there would have at least been some discussion of civil liberties and access to public space. So in conclusion, my feeling is that cities were and are a place of freedom, where young people used to feel that they could escape from the restrictive countryside and the sort of intimacy of communities in favour of anonymity of the city. But no surprise that with the city being ever increasingly regulated, provincial cities and towns seem a more attractive choice, with an emphasis on lifestyle. I mean, the moral imperative to clap for carers and the constant feeling of being watched by your neighbours, which we were reduced to during the lockdown, reduces us to being sort of village dwellers rather than urban citizens. So my plea would be to stop staring out of our windows and imagine what it would be like to be an active public again, and for visions of the city to look to a future where we once again celebrate the kind of freedom that we've seen in the past.
Thank you very much indeed, Vicki. That was very, very useful. Stadtluft macht frei turns into Stadtluft possibly kills you. So a useful kind of turnaround from what we kind of would have perceived as a city to have been for, throws the gauntlet down to our next speaker, Martin Environmental Powell. So Martin, if I can ask you to crack on with your 4 or 5 minutes.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the new middle name. I like the apocalyptic image of the bridge you showed on your invite. The one in disrepair with moss and algae all over it, because I thought this is actually something to strive for. It's wonderful at tackling air pollution. It avoids repainting with petroleum-based paints, encourages biodiversity. This is the new Highline. So we should not always look at these kind of images in a critical way. But what's a city for? Well, it's a very efficient place for social and cultural interaction. You can access a very rich variety of jobs. The choice to go to the exact interest group that you like. For example, the Agatha Christie fan club for left-handed people. And there's a lot of us. So you get the very focused, the very driven things that you want and search for, and that's not going to change. In the short term, we'll see these empty roads just filling up again. Somebody once said to me, if you have a road, cars will go on it. So we will return to a very congested set of streets again. The empty offices will not be vacated. Some businesses will leave, but many others will then arrive in their place. If we're lucky, some of the rents will be lowered and reset, and this will encourage a much richer and wider set of small businesses coming into the centers of cities. It might even help repurpose some of the clean industrial factories that we could put back into our urban centers. Which makes me think, what did we learn if we just go back to where we were before? I can tell you in New York, it's the city where I live, the PM 2.5, so this is the very fine particulate matter that you breathe into your lungs, in New York went from 12 micrograms per cubic meter to 4. And a Harvard study produced in May this year showed that if New York had gone from 12 micrograms to 11 for the last 20 years, there would have been 248 fewer COVID deaths during that time. And I can also say that now that number's probably doubled. So the fact that you can relate the number of COVID deaths to that very number should give us cause to think about the air pollution across our big urban centers. So the new normal, we'll see very accelerated trends to electric vehicles, and not just vehicles. I mean, cars, buses, scooters, yes, trains, planes, ports. We're going to see a massive uptake in electrification, purely for clean tailpipe emissions, for much more efficient transmission of energy. We're also going to see a very accelerated, decentralized set of energy grids, island sites powered by wind and solar, more resilient centers in the face of climate change and rapid urbanization. And this is going to be key also because it's going to save money and it's going to create a lot of jobs. If we're lucky, we'll also actually put the basic insulation into homes and offices that we should have been doing over the last 20 years. This actually creates more jobs per dollar spent or per pound spent than any other activity. So this recession may well just help rebalance some of these things. And then we are going to connect our infrastructure in a better way. So we're going to have data-led business cases. It's going to lead to a lot more smart city type projects, efficient infrastructure, better benefits for the urban dwellers. And then a comment that you made in your blurb about, do we let cities just shrink and die? Well, this doesn't happen. They don't just shrink and die. They shrink and die as a reaction to mismanagement, to trying to over-specialize or trying to focus in one area disrupts a very delicate ecosystem. So if people move away from a city, it's only because they didn't react to something that people didn't like. And to go back to Joel's New York, I can also say that, and I read this in the New York Times, but their population has gone down by 50,000 in the last year. And people say this is a direct reaction to ride sharing and Uber and Lyft and these other, just halving the traffic speeds over the last few years. Where will people go? Simply to another city. They will get the same trappings that they can get somewhere else, but without the traffic. So we will see this continued circulation, but we will see cities grow, people will keep coming. And if they don't like one city, they will simply go to a better one. Thank you.
Very good, very good. Always rely on you for a progressive environmental technical story. So it's normally, it's quite a novelty with some environmental commentators who maybe look on the bleak side. That's a very positive vision. Okay, where's Sylvia? Sylvia's up next, if you would, please. Sylvia, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Hi.
Cool.
Hi. Cool. So yeah, for me, the question of whether a city would die or not is actually very interesting. So all my life, I have lived in cities, in Hong Kong, in London, and in Rotterdam. And city life is almost like default for me. And then I never actually imagined the death of cities. So apparently, city life has a lot of its drawbacks. Crowded, polluted, stressful, spreading diseases. And especially now, many of us have the experience of work from home, which seems so nice. And now the question of whether cities would die seems to be much more legitimate and relevant, to me at least. But personally, I do really question whether cities have no merits anymore. And I also wonder whether work from home is really the solution to work-life balance, as suggested in the blog by Austin. So for me, I think a major merit of city is the convenience to be physically in different environments or scenarios within a very short period of time. So 1 minute you're at home cooking, and then 20 minutes later, you could be at a yoga studio, and then you take the metro and you're in the office in an hour. So I think basically the city offers the possibility for a person to easily be in different scenarios and take on different roles. And I think this possibility is something that suburbs or more rural environments do not really offer. And I think these multiple possible scenarios kind of bring intensity to a city. And then in order to sustain this kind of intensity, you need people to work and to offer services. So this means more jobs for skilled and unskilled people, and by extension, a stronger economy, I would say. And also a city with a lot of people brings more possibilities for social interactions. And of course, some people are kind of nonchalant about the presence of other human beings. But still, when you're around people, there is a chance for communications, and you can always choose to communicate with people if you want. So in general, I think a city allows more varieties in life. They create jobs, and they also bring possibility for actual interaction between people. And for these reasons, I kind of hope that cities would survive the COVID. And as for the argument that working from electronic cottages would bring better work-life balance, I do really have doubts about it. And I'm speaking from a very personal experience here. So I just moved to Rotterdam last year. I live by myself, and I do not have a lot of friends in town yet. So basically, the office is the place where I have proper interaction with other human beings. So when I was working from home between mid-March till like now, so 5 months now, so I was basically all by myself. So of course I get the flexibility to do self yoga during office hours, for example, but otherwise I was really isolated. And I constantly had doubts about whether I was self-disciplined enough. And to me, that really brought a kind of a different kind of stress, I would say. And of course, work from home also brings pressure to those with families. So imagine you have kids running around. I'm sure, yeah, we have that experience maybe. So I mean, while the idea of working from home seems liberating, it does actually bring a different kind of pressure, I would say, to life. And yeah, so I would prefer to not work from a domestic environment, at least not every day. And so as much as I kind of like cities and I'm not 100% fond of working from home, I understand that the COVID situation would bring changes to cities, and I can already see these changes. So for example, in Rotterdam, that was never really a complete lockdown. So shops were open and restaurants closed for a couple of months. People were encouraged to work from home and not take public transportation. And so the city was less busy than usual, but still it was kind of rather normal. And the major change there was basically social distancing. So everywhere in the city, shops, restaurants, offices, parks, now you see these devices or signage that make sure that people are 1.5 meters apart. So we have this idea of 1.5 meter society. And we see that people are still present in the city as in the past. They're just interacting with the city differently. They try to keep a physical distance with each other. And it's kind of the same in Hong Kong. So things were kind of open during the COVID situation. And then what people did, like rather than really staying at home, they basically wear face masks. And it is kind of business as usual in the city. So I think from my observation in Rotterdam and Hong Kong, the COVID hasn't really killed cities yet. So rather it has changed how people interact with cities. And social distancing and face masks are basically the measures to make sure that we can still hold on to kind of city life even under the pandemic. And I believe cities are here to stay even after the COVID, but for sure there will be changes. And to kind of allow a safe proximity between people, security and comfort. And I think a major question is how fast cities would change.
Sylvia, thank you very much indeed. Nicely skipped over Hong Kong there. But you raised some very interesting points, especially like in conjunction with what Martin was talking about, the technical versus maybe the human side, the human story. So final speaker we have is Tim Abrams. Tim, are you there? There's the man.
Hi. Hi. Thanks everybody. Some really interesting points. Trying to jump around and think about replying to them, but I think I'll just stick with what I was initially going to plan to say, which is just to talk about the ideas of modernism and modernity, which is going on. I think that coronavirus has really helped us, or is enacting a change in our understanding of how they operate on the city. We think of Rem Koolhaas in Delirious New York, sort of describes Manhattan from 1850 onwards as a laboratory for the invention and testing of the culture of congestion, and that Manhattan in particular is an exercise in, if humans are going to live in close proximity, let's make that into a drama, a psychodrama even, moments of the city where you get great understandings of the congestion, the subway system, the Rockefeller Center. There was a great piece, and we could contrast that. There was a great piece written by Richard Williams in the New York Times during lockdown, where he described modernism, the modernism and post-coronavirus change in appreciation of the modernist city. He talks about Le Corbusier's great advocacy of hygienism, himself a hygiene freak, and describes the reinvention, reappraisal of a city like Brasilia as a place that one would want, a city that that used to be looked upon negatively for having no people in it, but suddenly in a post-coronavirus landscape, that becomes an attractive landscape. So you have this kind of culture of congestion versus a hygienist perspective, and I think it picks up what Joel Kotkin was describing, and some of what Vicki was talking about. The city centre in Europe and North America, particularly, is becoming a more conservative place, and that's pre-coronavirus. It's in Joel's books, he's described the change of the city toward more white, more middle class, more affluent, a kind of reverse of the white flight. But as we're seeing during coronavirus, it's not just a kind of change of social mix. It's more there's more a social outlook. The city centres, you know, the slow changing of traffic regulations in city centres, the kicking out the diesel, the different legislations across different cities which are controlling the kind of traffic which is allowed into the city. It was doubled down on during the lockdown when the traffic lanes were immediately closed down, and cities all across Europe. It wasn't just London. It happened in Barcelona as well, and it was done in a way in which there was no real local consultancy. There was no real democratic mandate for this. There's also obviously, and this can be exaggerated, but there is definitely a sense that the hygienic control of the coronavirus itself, the mask wearing, the regulation of the 2 meters, 1.5 meters. If you're fortunate enough to live in Rotterdam, we're going to stay that extra 50 centimeters away if we're in the UK. I don't know what it is about us that require that 50 centimeters, but we do. So you kind of have this, you know, we have these two trends in modernity and modernism of the congested city and the hygienic city. And yet what we seem to be having developing and evolving during and being exaggerated during the coronavirus is the worst of both worlds, a kind of theatre of congestion, a kind of hygienic congestion. You know, the images now, or the positive images we now see of cities, are a profusion of cyclists cycling through the city rather than a mix of traffic with traffic moving in and out. There's a kind of that congestion is safe and hygienically controlled. It's also either the empty streets or the theatre of mask. And we've talked a lot about the way in which cities will come back from coronavirus, but I do think that there is essentially a doubling down on a tendency which was already happening of a kind of city centres actually becoming controlled spaces. I think conversely, and if just to kind of go back to just to think a little bit about Hannah Arendt and her description of the polis, that the polis can be wherever it is. I forget the exact phrase. I think actually the suburban areas of our cities are going to become more freer and the increasingly more attractive in terms of places to be. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting change of use work looking at suburban malls going on, and I think it's an exciting time, but a time in which, as Joel says, there's going to be great change.
Very good. Thank you very much, Tim. Look, can I throw out one question, or maybe I'll end up doing 2 or 3, but let's start with the one. Because even at the very beginning with Joel and Vicki, there was this oppositional perception of the city. So I read from Joel a kind of very useful, positive idea that cities will survive. You know, don't worry about it; they'll come back. They're not going to die. That's fair enough. And then Vicki said that actually, but in some senses, and in lots of this dialogue, the narrative is that we don't want cities to survive necessarily. Actually, cities are kind of toxic spaces or excluded spaces, as Tim was just pointing out, that they are somehow conflicted spaces that we ought to maybe not celebrate. So, and it ran through many of your introductions. So does anybody want to pick up on that contradiction? Because in some senses, there is a conscious planning, as Tim was pointing out, in modernism, there's a conscious planning of cities. And on the other hand, there's a kind of a passive, fatalistic, history of cities has always been this way, therefore they're going to come back, don't worry about it. So do we have to have much more of a active intervention in creating the city, or is it just going to come back and it is what it is? Do you understand my question? Since there's a horrible silence, let me just quickly say that Joe, you said in your book in 2005, your book on cities.
She unmuted herself, so I think Vicki may have something to say.
I know she always got something to say, but let me just quickly say, you said that cities were humanity's single greatest creation and expression of our ingenuity, beliefs, and ideals. And on that level, it's like saying today, what are our current ingenuity, beliefs, and ideals that would create new cities?
Well, I just want to basically, one of the most important things is to understand what do we define as a city? Is a city what, planners, mass transit, people living in apartments, is that a city, or is a suburb part of the city? The Frank Lloyd Wright, who I think was, more on to things than, well, he and Wells, I guess. But one of the things Frank Lloyd Wright said is, the city is wherever the citizen goes. So if somebody lives 40 miles from Los Angeles, they're still a Southern Californian. They're still part of this urban life. And that urban life it has more varied. I thought it was a very good point I think Tim made, which is suburbs are changing. They're becoming, for instance, much more diverse. Actually, if you really want good ethnic food in most of the United States, you go to the suburbs. Here in Orange County, we have the best Vietnamese food. You want good Indian food, you go out to Fort Bend County, where they've also built a gigantic Hindu temple. Because guess what? Immigrants tend to have kids. And if they have money, they go to places that are good for kids. Now, the distinction between which Wells made, which is the urban life really works best for people without kids. If you're very rich, you can get around it. But if you need space, I can tell you during this lockdown here in California, the fact that we have a house with a backyard and a pool, and of course we have California weather, which when you talk about people biking around, I've been in London in December. I don't know how much I'd like to bike around then, but the fact is that you have essentially two different ways of expressing urbanism. One is more dense than the other. One is more family oriented than the other. So I think those two things. And then one last thing, which I find a little shocking, is I think that the social inequality issue of cities is much more important than COVID over time. That's what the book on neo-feudalism talks about in great detail. And somehow, if we're going to imagine the future of cities, and we have maybe this elite core, and then we have the suburbs, but what about the people who fall between those cracks? Because what we're seeing in the United States for sure is when you have that breakdown in social order, you then get all sorts of terrible things as we've been experiencing in the United States. And those are going to be more dangerous to the future of cities than a virus.
Cool. Yeah,
Austin,
please, Vicki,
can I go?
please.
Yeah.
You can indeed.
Yeah, I mean, I really disagree that cities are not places for families. I mean, as somebody that kind of brought up a family in central London, I really think that my ability to kind of get to work quickly and be surrounded by amenities and facilities and other people, people who could help, people I could socialize with and hang out with, was actually, really key thing for me to be able to, access public life. And I mean, the thought of women sort of being confined to sort of small town provincial life, really cuts down on the number of opportunities. And I think that the workplace is a space, particularly for women, to really kind of make themselves as individuals, whereas the domestic private sphere is not. And I think that's, you know, I was very sympathetic with Sylvia's comments about working from home. I mean, one of the key things to all of this, I think, is transport, which keeps coming up again and again in everything that people have talked about. And I really do feel that, you know, that London in particular, but other cities too, are really lacking visionary ideas on public transportation system. And it's completely inadequate to think that cycling is going to be a solution for everybody, even though I am a cyclist. You know, I'm a quite diehard cyclist, but even in the middle of winter, I resort happily to the tube. And so I think that we have to start, you know, in order to allow people to have this kind of this sense of being part of the public, being able to make themselves in the public sphere and to encounter people that are going to challenge them and you know, give us all ideas. I think we need new visions for cities based on investment in public transport that will allow us to be connected, to connect the suburbs with the city centre, to imagine new cities beyond the existing ones, and to connect us together. And in that sense, I'm really in favour of HS2 as just, you know, one step towards doing that. But I think we need to go a lot further.
Austin, just one little, what we would call a point of order, which is individual people may raise their kids in cities, but if you look at the statistics, the denser the area, the fewer children. One of the big issues in Asia is that incredibly expensive housing and density leads to less kids. So yes, anecdotally, people can make that move, but in reality, they don't. Also, in terms of connections, I think the digital connections are pretty powerful, and nobody is suggesting that women necessarily want to work in an office if they have kids, but that doesn't mean that they don't work. I mean, I just think that there are more variety of experiences. I think age is also going to be a big distinguishing point. People in their 20s and early 30s are going to tend to be attracted to cities. As they get older, that's less so. And this is all statistically vetted. So I just want to raise that.
Okay. I think, just very quickly, I think that rather than density giving rise to fewer children, it's also mainly development, wealth, that kind of thing, which may come with density, but or a reflection of density. But I think that's a key component, isn't it? I think that's a rhetorical point, Joel. So chew on that for a moment. Tim.
Yeah, I think one of the, I mean, it's interesting to start, you were talking about the ideas of planning. Where is the idea, where, you know, the modernist idea of planning a city, where is that today? Well, unfortunately, it's and it relates a little to what Vicki and Joel were kind of discussing. The 15-minute city is this kind of planning idea, which was being put back by Professor Carlos Moreno and Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, kind of campaigned on it, and it's being picked up in Milan, Barcelona are looking at it. And I can't think of anything, particularly in Paris, I can't think of a worse idea, an idea that's more designed more to entrench the gap between the urban core and the suburban. We were talking earlier about trying to define how there is clearly going to be some form of new relationship between the suburbs and the urban areas. I think we might have strong ideas about how they're going to go, but I think we can agree that there's some degree of fluidity in these relationships. What the 15-minute city seems to be wanting doing is saying, here's all you need within 15 minutes so you don't have to go any further. Oh, by the way, which is just, I mean, anyone who's been to Paris has seen the rampant difference between the suburbs and the urban area, in which there's this kind of bobo, you've got everything, you've got your boulanger and you've got your patisserie and you've got your Richard Scarry French word books of everything you want in your arrondissement. And then you've got this outlying district, which is just effectively a dormitory. And this just, that this is being picked up and seriously proposed as a planning idea is just seems to be like, it's like the suburban, you know, it's like everything bad about the suburbs imported into the urban area. It's like it's cutting off opportunity. It doesn't, this is a kind of strange, and he's a smart city guy, you know. This is coming from this is coming from kind of like a smart city background, which really makes me deeply concerned that you were right about smart cities. That's what really worries me, Austin.
Don't drag me into.
I think it's something. I do think it's something that's good. The 15-minute city should be really pushed back on. Every time I hear about it, something deeply reactionary is hiding underneath it.
Okay, that was a 15-minute contribution. Hang on a second. We're going to bring Martin in and Sylvia, and partly to comment on this conversation, but also there was that disjunction between the two of you in some ways. I don't want to over-egg it, but there was the kind of the smart city technical solution, which I am always worried that, you know, cities become seen as just data sets rather than real people. And Sylvia was doing this kind of human appeal for a little bit of kind of recognition about the real people who inhabit cities. So again, you can talk about that if you want to, or anything else that's been discussed. So Sylvia, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I actually got a response to Tim's comment. So basically, yeah, what Tim suggested is really an ideal scenario. Basically, that's a choice or a mix between the urban center life and kind of suburb life. But yeah, I think for the context of Hong Kong, for example, this is not something necessarily possible because Hong Kong is just so small and then so congested. So basically, if let's say we want to have kind of a suburban kind of life, as Joel like advocates, is just impossible because yeah, there is just not enough land. And then Hong Kong's transportation infrastructure is also very developed. So yeah, by default, people can easily travel to, let's say, New Territories, which is more kind of a rural area, to the city center to work. And then yeah, just yeah. Yeah, I guess my point is like suburban life is not necessarily possible in all geographical locations, especially in Asia.
True. Okay, Martin, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just a couple of things to pick up on. You know, data is an amazing thing. It doesn't give you the answer, but it does rule out the really terrible ideas that people think are going to solve the problem. There's a lot of people back in my London life that said, oh, we need more cycling. Cycling will solve everything. You know, our modal share for cycling is somewhere hovering at 2%. If it goes any higher, the average journey will just go up for everybody else. Everyone says we could be more like Copenhagen. They have 54% modal share of cycling. You know, I can cycle across Copenhagen, the entirety of the city, in 15 minutes. Okay, Tim's going to love that 15 minute. So all I'm saying is that you've created a city like London that's big and huge and wonderful for that reason. But in order to cross it, actually, you need the buses and you need the vehicles. We do 5 million trips per day by bus in London out of a total of 26 million. Okay, we do another 4 million on the underground. We do it because you can achieve high speeds, you can get across the city. The whole purpose of transport is to connect people to a work environment, to get them from home to work as quickly as possible. So there's something in the 15-minute idea. I think it's a very small number, but the idea that we allow people to connect to the places they want to see, go to, work in, play at is really, really key. But I do think by looking at the data, you can also be very, very sensible about the next wave of solutions rather than these kind of ideas that a little electric scooter can buzz you around London wonderfully. You know, this is just not the reality. So that's the only point I wanted to make.
It's useful. I would only add to this that, you know, while your statistics are admirable and the algorithms and obviously without shadow of a doubt correct, except it doesn't take allowance for the fact that, you know, StreetCon is offering 15% ridership and public transport to minimize the threat of coronavirus proximity, and also that general mood of fear, paranoia about being close to people, and this has genuinely affected the mood of the city. So, you know, that notion of public transport being somehow kind of beneficial and useful and efficient, which obviously it should be, somehow is kind of given lie by the fact that people aren't using it, and so those statistics suddenly go out the window when you deal with the realities.
I do agree, Austin. I do agree with you in this moment in time. But again, and to use your words, I am an optimistic environmentalist. But I do believe that, you know, we will get past this and we will find a vaccine and we will begin to reduce the number of cases, and you know, we will get back to a new normal that actually allows us to move around the city wonderfully on fantastic world-class public transport that London does have and New York nearly has. Sorry, that one was the Joel.
We can all dream. I like the fact that Tim talked about a profusion of cyclists. It's not the collective noun that I would use for cyclists, but that's another story. Look, I can see 3 hands have gone up already, which is all good. I have millions more questions, so if you don't put your hands up, I will be forced to continue, which obviously no one really wants that to happen. So let me just take the ones that are up now. So like I say, if you click on participants, you see the little picture on the right-hand side, and you can just click raise hand next to your name. Yes. Okay, can we take Sheila, please? Sheila McNerney. I'll just... Oh, hang on, you're muted. Sheila, you are muted. Can you unmute yourself, Sheila?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I just wanted to comment, Joel and Tim, outside of London in the UK, I'm going to be parochial, I'm going to be UK. Outside of London, every city is a 15-minute city already. So that debate is quite interesting in terms of the economic power and might of anything in the UK outside of London. You get to a suburb in 4 kilometres in cities outside of London. But the points I wanted to make, Austin, were, to the panel, I'm a fan of cities, so I start from a perspective where I really agree with a lot of what's been said. I'm a fan of urban history, and I trained
review the Bristol webinar information, because I think...
Stop. Nico, mute, thank you. Sorry about that, Sheila.
And I trained in conscious planning, I think somebody referred to it as earlier on. So I start with really wanting to hold on to all of these ideas, but can we just do a what if? What if everything we've been taught about locational geography is now wrong, or at least changing? What if our idea of a city as a romantic pretense is actually changing? So if finance doesn't need to be in a city centre, for the first time in history, it doesn't physically need to be in the city centre because of those changes in technology. The working from home debate is not about it being great for workers. It's about the fact that they don't need to pay rent in Canary Wharf. Imagine a world where that doesn't happen. Then the city does not need to be serviced in the same way. If you take the financial sector out of the centre of London and out of other city centres, then what is the city for? There's going to be nothing going on but legal wrangles about rent in these cities. So if that past has gone and there's something genuinely different going on, I just want to finish with a small anecdote, because it really struck me only this morning on the day of this debate. So a young woman I know, a 28-year-old Manchester academic, and her husband, recently promoted within the civil service in their late 20s, have decided to work from home just outside of Florence in Italy for the next 4 months. So till January 2021, the civil service is going to function, and academia in a certain part of Manchester University is going to function. And I think this is not just sort of, sort of clever play with words about working from home. I think it's a serious question about how this changes the function of cities. I personally think that mass unemployment is actually going to reshape this. So, those 2 people, are they going to have a job in 2 years? Those who can pay will access the disease-free activities that they've always been able to access through paying for it. So if you can pay for an Airbnb rental for 4 months in Tuscany, you can still be a civil servant in our country. So for me, it's not the virus making the moment, it's technology and authoritarianism. Who wants to live in such a rule-based environment that city centres have become? And I think we might well all change our minds in about 18 months' time. I think we will drive ourselves away from city centres and I'm a fan of a city.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, a useful reminder of the reality of what's going on, economic recession, depression, collapse, people moving out, as part of just a general state of economic affairs, as well as, you know, actual conscious decision making. So hold those thoughts in mind. I'll take two more hands are up, and please let's have some more hands, please. We have Joe Hurley.
Mine is, I suppose, two questions really. One is I'm just interested to know what influence people think universities are having on cities. Where I live in Nottingham, there has been quite a few discussions and debates. And I think that's the same in many provincial cities, where the role of universities over many years has had quite an impact on shaping cities, because it's one of the areas where money has been attracted. So it feels like universities have played a bit of a substitute for growth strategies within cities. The second factor in relation to cities that has quite a big impact, and surprisingly I think also potentially reveals some of the lack of reveals the weakness of cities to plan, is the influence of student accommodation. There's cranes, you know, around Nottingham at the moment. Nearly all of the building planning applications in the city are around student accommodation, and it's something that the City Council has only limited control over, and that does influence the shape of accommodation, what that accommodation is used for, and that does begin to influence the very nature of the city in terms of it being consistently transient and people not necessarily having a strong identity with the city. So there does seem to be something quite important about that. The second thing, again, it relates to the issue about the economy and growth, is that, again, taking Nottingham as an example, is this city is still reeling from the recession in 2008. And most of the development work that's happening here is the City Council working with business. We're lucky that we do have HS2 coming in close vicinity. And a lot of the developments here are attempts by the City Council to try and supplement their lack of central government funding. And therefore they're using all of their property assets, trying to attract people into the local area. And I know in places like Manchester, similar things are happening where people are trying to substitute the lack of council tax, bringing in the sort of higher spend rental accommodation. So there are lots of factors that seem to me related to regeneration and a lack of growth strategy that in different ways are having quite an impact on who lives in the city and how people live in the city.
Okay, thank you very much. Look, the reason I'm just agitated in my seat is I gave the speakers just 4 minutes and the contributions are lasting for twice as long. But interesting as they are, so that's very useful. Let me just take one more, and again, bear in mind my brevity note there, from Peter Gordon, please.
Can you hear me?
Indeed.
That's good. Quick word about cycling. It's fine, doesn't create any emissions. I'm actually pedestrian, and one thing that's getting worse is more cyclists on pavement, cyclists in the street. Nothing against cycling. Could we have a separate pedestrian SAR who doesn't also look after cycling? That's just an aside before I start the main question. Main thing, if you look at the centre of London, right before COVID, compared to when I moved to London in the start of the 80s, there are far more people. I've tried to do some research. In fact, I think a lot of them come not from that far out, but from the suburbs. But it's a fact that the cities are great places, if you like, for social intercourse, particularly the weekend. Will that continue? I hope it does. We'll have to see what happens. As far as offices are concerned, the interesting thing will be, I think certainly there's going to be a move towards home working. Question is, I think it's not going to be absolute. I think people still want to come into the office and meet their colleagues. Will that be 2 days a week, 3 days a week? I don't know. I know a lot of civil servants, they used to work at home 1 day a week. That was fairly common. We're probably going to see more than that. Now, will that be matched by more people coming in and working less time in central London, so it'll still be as busy, or not? I don't know is the answer to that. But if we just see what happens. But there are so many facilities in London that really serve the south east of the whole of London. I would certainly hope that they wouldn't disappear, but we will see. I think it depends how quickly we get back to normal, whether there will be a vaccine. If there's no vaccine, we have to wait for herd immunity. It could be 2 years until we're
okay, let's not get into vaccines. Okay, look, I've got a couple more hands waiting, but if I just come straight back to the panelists, please, just to address any of those points, or anything that's arisen out of those points that you want to try and talk through would be very useful. Who wants to go? Tim.
Can I? Sheila, great points. Every city outside London is a 50-minute city. Yeah, that's because you're allowed to drive around in your cars and we aren't. 50-minute city as proposed in Paris is you're not walking, you're allowed a bike, and that's it. That's the prescriptive date of the 50-minute city. Also, it was a good point about that. There was there was a piece about the 15-minute city in the FT, and there's a word in there which I wonder if you can notice, which is the key word. It says, the mass global switch to working from home suddenly makes multi-hour commutes appear wasteful, a clock-watching office life inefficient. Ironically enough, the French automobile group PSA, which makes Peugeot, Vauxhall and Citroën cars, was early to seize the opportunity to shift its non-production workforce to permanent remote mode. Non-production workforce. This is what we're talking about. The 15-minute city is all fine and well and good, but when you start moving mass groups of people from one where they want to live to workplaces which require working, I mean, the 15 minutes is, let's just say goodbye to it. And that's what the modern zoning system is all about. And to try and disrupt that, there's only going to be one group of beneficiaries and one group of losers. And so that's why it cuts against it. There's a good point by Penny in the comments too, talking about the fact that that this is all well and good to talk about anti-urban, the anti-urbanism spread out, but where are the people where are the planners who are benefiting from this? Where are the planners enabling this? And I think that's the area we need to look at. That's the place that is interesting. At the moment in the UK, it's Prince Charles.
Dr. Stott. Okay, any other members of the panel would like to come back on these points, or even what we were discussing earlier?
Can I just I mean, on sheet.
Let's take Vicky, and I'll come back.
Okay.
Sheila's concerns about the city and the head of the civil service working from Tuscany and so on. I mean, I think that one of the drivers for getting people back into the city will be smaller businesses that really kind of need to get back to work, and they need their people around them, because I think it's all very well kind of senior managers working from home in the luxury of their villas and big houses with gardens, but for the vast majority of people, working from home is really not an easy experience, with lack of space and families, and younger people need mentoring. And I'd say that the same goes for teaching in universities, that it really, we're going to be getting to the kind of limits of what we can do digitally. At the moment, we've been kind of running on, I suppose, ideas and contacts and knowledge of our colleagues and students that is a hangover from the months leading up to the lockdown. But I don't think that can last forever. I think we need to kind of rebuild those connections, and businesses can, which are the real driver of the UK economy, won't be able to do that if with their workforce remotely. So and I think also remember that outside of London, most cities, less than 50% of people have been working at home during the lockdown as it is. And even in London, it's around 50% of people have had to carry on going and to work in the city, even during the height of the lockdown. So it's a rather sort of, I think it's a sort of privileged perspective that says that we can all carry on working from home. Not to say that there won't be changes to the city, and I think we should be looking for changes to the city and thinking about different uses. But, you know, like people have said, many of these changes have already started happening. Like the City of London already has a cultural strategy where they're keen to turn over, to diversify the city from finance. I mean, it's been changing for a long time. The emphasis on culture in the City of London was part of a plan that they wrote in 2018 for the next 5 years to build museums and concert halls and so on. So I think some of these trends are already happening.
Thank you very much. Joel?
Yeah, just a lot of the other points have been discussed, but the point about the university I was very interested in, because so many cities have tried to build their economies around universities. But everything is a moving target. I mean, I think we're going to have hybrid work, and I think we're going to have hybrid education. What we're seeing in the United States is many of the smaller schools, particularly in both in New York and in big cities, and also in small towns, are financially insolvent. We're charging too much money, producing too little value. The universities are also have, you know, sort of ideological craziness on top of everything else. I think we're going to see that more and more of education is going to take place, particularly older people, online, and maybe with an occasional seminar kind of environment. But I don't think universities are going to be the source of money in most cases that they have been in lots of places. More and more employers know that these degrees are pretty much worthless anyway, except in some of the technical fields. And I just think that the counting on the university, what we call in the United States eds and meds, is probably limited, particularly on the ed side. The meds may have a better future.
Can I just quickly say that Kingston University is a magnificent school. But I also wanted to point out that actually the little bit of reality you brought in there, Joel, to say that there's a collapse in the university sector, that they're all financially unviable, notwithstanding their inherent unviability, the fact that coronavirus has now brought on this kind of denial of foreign students, and the UK as well as America has always relied for the last 40 years on foreign students paying exorbitant fees, and the reliance on those, which is why, to go back to Joe's point, why they're building these halls of accommodation to give, hotel standard accommodation for foreign students, is now the whole thing is a house of cards just about to collapse. But in terms of the building universities and the influence of them in building cities, I don't know whether Sylvia wants to comment on it, because obviously it's a China phenomenon in the new cities where the universities are almost built first to encourage those kind of young people with the spending power to come in, from which might spark a more dynamic city centre. But I'm putting words in your mouth, Sylvia. Do you want to come back on any of these points?
Yeah, I actually have a response to Vicki's idea about like working from home isn't possible for everyone, and instead of like really anticipating people to work from home, I think what we're seeing are changes to offices in the cities. So for example, we can see that the design of offices now have been adapted to allow this kind of social distancing. And yeah, I think what we should aim for is really to create a safe environment for people to work at in cities, rather than expecting everyone to be working from home in the long term. I think as Sheila mentioned, her friends, they booked the house for 4 months. I think there's a reason to that, because that basically implies they are expecting to come back to the office at some point.
Okay, any final comments from the panel for what's been said, just to round up?
Just a quick comment on the university piece, because I thought it was an interesting question. I think universities will continue to thrive inside cities. It's where they set up incubators, it's where they connect with businesses, it's where they connect with finance houses, and there's a role for physical proximity in coming up with the new innovations and new ideas, and I think that will continue. A salesperson in my organization said to me very desperately, they said, how am I supposed to find new customers if I can't meet them? And it was very interesting that they don't see this as meeting people. They see this as something different. So this kind of physical proximity idea is always going to play forward. I think that's not going to disappear. So having universities where they are, I think, is very, very important.
Okay. Tim, were you busting to come in then? No.
Sorry, I think the university idea is very strong. I think one of the great, if you look back at the way the universities in California evolved after the 1950s, they went to near business, to where business was, and the solution for universities with the foreign students drying up is proximity to business, and those are going to be. It's interesting that here in Oxford, I know you want me to sort of reference my Oxford location, but the new business park being built here is definitely about looking towards proximity. Even, you know, finally after 900 years, the Oxford University is actually looking to engage with, put itself in close proximity with a business world, and that's taking place in a suburban location. I think that, and that that whole evolution of the retail, the business crossover university park is an area of potential, particularly in the UK with the Oxford, the Cambridge link up. I think it's an area of hope for the university. Nottingham, not far beyond it. Yeah.
Okay. We'll organise another discussion on whether education should be allied to business, the business of education, or whether it should be education for education's sake, but that's another conversation. Let me go to the hands. So we have Dennis and Bernie, one or either or both.
Hi, it's Dennis.
Hi, Dennis.
Just on the question of the universities, I'm just reading a book at the moment by a guy called John Sexton, who's the recently retired head of NYU, New York University. He's been replaced by the former head of Oxford University, Andrew Hamilton. But he makes the point in his book that the universities are key to the future of the cities. He makes the point that NYU, for example, is distilling its relationship with Abu Dhabi and with Shanghai and with other places, that these places become the centers of not just, you know, finance, but research, development, technology, medicine across the whole board. They are linked, of course, by, which is another key aspect of their contention, that globalization is extremely significant in the way the world is going for cities particularly. And the cities who manage to sort of centralize the whole university research development, all of that sector, will be the people who survive, in a sense, across the world. And that these cities then will be kind of populated by people who he calls patriotic cosmopolitans. And that's the interesting point for me as well, because what he's basically saying is that, you know, a kind of, I suppose, a rootless strata of people interconnected with each other who are basically, I suppose you could say, calling the shots. But the reality for me in the city today, notwithstanding COVID, is that the political culture that exists today, which is quite dominant, and of course, which is really anti the whole notion of sovereignty, and not a city being London being the capital city of the UK, based in the national entity that is the UK, that notion has been sort of disparaged. And the culture that permeates through to the reality of people's lives living in the city is one of diversity and all of that. But the reality of that with the political culture that we have is that lives are becoming increasingly problematic. Living in this kind of culture is increasingly problematic for vast amounts of people. Just to give you a kind of very small example, I live on a housing estate in Islington, and I've got people from Afghanistan, from Latin America, from all over the world around me. and their cultural preferences are not kind of, you know, contained within some concept of we all living together in a national entity. The lady across the hall speaks to her grandmother in Latin America at 1 o'clock in the morning and shouts because that's the suitable time to speak to her grandmother at that particular time. And that's an endless process permeating throughout all these so-called great diverse areas. Yeah, we get some nice restaurants, I know, but the reality of living the life in this kind of, with the political culture influencing things on how a city goes, seems to me to be a big problem. How did I unmute him?
Sorry, Michael Owens. Can we take Michael, please?
Yeah, sure. So the suggestion, there's a suggestion here that suburbs will play a different role in the city. You know, given the way that that life is likely to change, and so it harks back to an older idea that, you know, of the suburbs and embracing, you know, the idea of suburban living and embracing the kind of, you know, the idea of the sprawl of the city, and, you know, and that kind of thing, and basically not being snobby about the suburbs. So I mean, I live in Kingston, so half an hour from London, and I've tried to love it. You know, it's a beautiful park, lovely river, nice town centre. But the fact of it is that it's really dull. You know, the big thing that Kingston has got going for us is that you can be in Waterloo reasonably quickly, and it would be better if you could get there even faster. So, you know, it's, I mean, I'm fairly obviously, like, the way we talk about places, it's often a metaphor, isn't it, for something else. So, you know, we talk about, you know, the kind of urban, it used to be a coded way of speaking about race, didn't it? You know, that kind of thing. And so it seems to me it's important for us not to, you know, not to basically have a kind of a, you know, talk about the suburbs and imagine that we're actually speaking about, for example, the middle class, or about, you know, the kind of marginal Parisians and so on. But the real question for me is that if we allow the idea that, you know, the cities will grow, you know, that more people will want to continue to want to live in the suburbs, the question is, how can they be connected to the kind of complex city, all of the kinds of opportunities for, you know, for being physically with the people that you want to be with, or choosing who you connect with, how you make yourself in the city. So that sees the suburbs as, you know, something like a cell in a really big complex arrangement, rather than a flight from complexity as it's sometimes discussed. So I think there's a kind of question about the physical location of suburbs, and then that gets overlaid with the digital question, you know, because in part it's true, isn't it, that our digital connectivity is a solution for us. Here I am, you know, in a wonderful conversation with people from all around London, from all around the world, and so on. So in that sense, I'm making my choices about who I connect with. But there's something about digital connections that are also really flattening, you know, and sometimes quite spooky. So I think you can't kind of replace, you know, the kind of physical connection, the real kind of social life face to face, ultimately with digital connections. So it seems to me if we want to reimagine space, you know, the kind of geographical question that Sheila raised, we have to rethink how these places, which are comfortable, how they connect into the big complex city in a social sense.
Lovely, thank you very much. Before we move on to the next speaker, I just want to clarify that Kingston is a very nice place. The university is first class, and you get a very good student experience. Thank you. Okay, Phil Mullen, please.
Thanks, Austin. Historically, we know that previous big health crises and pandemics have prompted a similar sort of discussion about the future of cities. And so what I'm interested in is what's different about the discussion this time. And listening to what people are saying, it seems there's two distinct aspects that we should see are related, but are quite distinct. One is this sort of the cultural discussion about where the city's going, and the other thing is the objective trends. And the two don't necessarily, or the objective trends don't necessarily, and I think are very unlikely to follow the cultural discussion. So I think the cultural discussion, which I think that Vicki focused on, is I think very different in that what she called the antipathy to the city that's been revealed is I think of a more qualitatively acute level than in previous such crises, and I think that reflects the broader sort of cultural malaise, the sense of uncertainty, the sense of vulnerability, the sense of sort of anxiety about where society is going, which then gets transposed onto the city. So that I think that creates a more acute discussion, and certainly reading what you read in the newspapers and so on, that discussion has taken off a lot more than was objectively necessary. I think on the objective side, I do think there's a little bit of an underestimation that what cities have been for work, and I think again Vicki is right to say that the looking at what's going on in the working from home discussion from the standpoint of the individual manager or the individual academic or the individual journalist who can work from wherever they want is a very narrow, unreal perspective. And generally, I think the working from home discussion has become a rather sort of fetishized obsession, which distracts from the fact that for a large number of people, there aren't going to be jobs. Those people go off for 4 months, as Sheila alluded to, they might not have jobs when they come back. So I think the city, in terms of the objective influences, is going to be the fact that the city as a place where you go to for work for most people, whether because you're providing a service and you need to be interacting with people or because work is a collaborative process, that's going to be decimated. So when Joel says, in his view, in his thesis, the social crisis trumps the health crisis, I think we should get to grips with the economic crisis, and the jobs crisis is going to even trump the social crisis. That's a thing that's going to provoke changes, because if you don't have jobs in the city, not for technology reasons, but because you don't need the jobs, or you don't have other areas of activity going on, that's the objective thing that's going to be hollowing out cities and forcing them to change.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll take one more, Alistair Donald, please.
Yes, thanks, Austin. I think Tim's onto something actually with his hygienic congestion description. I think possibly better thought about as hygienic density rather than congestion. I mean, congestion to me has something. It implies a social, cultural dynamic to it, and one that exceeds the boundaries of what's previously been possible. That's why you get congestion. Whereas I think that the thing that the city is, the condition of the city the last 20 odd years or so has been one of hygienic density. Density being a much more technical, managerial ambition that planners have harbored. And it's worth remembering that it's I think it was the 21st anniversary of Towards an Urban Renaissance last month, which was the document really that set the trend for how cities have been built over the last 20 years or so, which was all about, it was a policy of constraint on how the social life of a city, whether it's controls on antisocial behavior or lifestyle policing or all the rest of it, controls on economic action because consumption was seen as being a problem, controls on movement and mobility because it was being seen as an environmental problem. So that's been the kind of condition of the city the last 20 odd years, that hygienic density taking all the life out of it. And then for that reason, I think the suburbs are quite interesting, actually. I agreed with a lot of what Mick said, but not all of it, because, I don't think you can talk about the suburbs as just one thing. I think there's a number of different things. I mean, I was in Scotland recently and very different suburban experience to outer London. But nevertheless, there has been a dynamic in some of the suburbs just now where there's a kind of economic interest in doing things getting businesses going, investing in small office spaces. There's something interesting going on there. There's also, some of the most interesting museums I've been to in the last year or so have been in suburbs outside of the type of museums that have been planted in city centres over the past 20 years. So suburbs aren't perfect, but I think there's kind of interesting things going on that are slightly freer than the city centres, which have been so controlled. And I think that's something to take heart from, while by no means being the solution. We need much more, obviously.
Okay, thanks. Some wag might say that Scotland is a suburb. I know, but that's a terrible joke, obviously. I have one other hand from Dominic Standish. And just before Dominic, you come in, just to say there's a really lively conversation going on in the chat room. It's very difficult for me to read while I'm concentrating on the speakers. So if anybody wants to kind of raise any of those points at the very last moment, just to throw back at the panel, that would be very, very useful. Please feel to speak out. But anyway, Dominic, please, Dominic Standish. Are you there, Dominic? Oh. See, that's it. We always want a big finish. Dominic, are you there? If you are, you're muted. If you're not,
you got me now.
There we go. There we go. There we go.
Yeah, I have a very simple question for the panelists. It's been a very interesting discussion. I agree with a lot of points that have been made. One of my concerns is where is the net increase in city dwellers? Obviously, it's very difficult to generalise because so many cities around the world are very different. But here in Italy, there's been a big increase in moving out of cities to countries like this. You know, when I'm looking today with my son, who is at Imperial College, looking at student accommodation in London, there is a plethora because of the downfall in international students, obviously happening all around the world. I think we also do need to take into account, in relation to the hygiene discussion, the fear that many people have of living in cities and in proximity to others and being placed in a city lockdown again. And certainly in Italy, that is a motivating factor for a lot of people moving out of cities into countryside properties. Their finance is moving out, fewer students are coming in. You know, where is the net increase in city population? I don't see it.
Grant, thank you very much, Dominic. Very kind of you. Do we have any final speakers? I can't see at the moment. No, I think we're winding up. So there's an awful lot of stuff on the table here. So can I ask the panelists just to come back on any parts at all in this? So you have Tim's raised hand, and then we'll see who's next. Tim, please.
Yeah, I wanted to come back on Mick's. I'm sorry. You all right, Mick? Is it all right out there? How you doing? It's good to see you. I think, yeah, there's nothing wrong with the idea of the suburb as being kind of remote from the city centre. Part of the rhetoric of urban development in the last 30 years has been the city as cultural destination. And I think that what is, you know, this was always for the city breakers, but actually this is now going to transfer and become the urban dweller. You know, the whole constitution is set up for not, Alistair's points notwithstanding about the cultural institutions being more interesting outside the city centre. These big national institutions are always going to be there. They are just part of a stone's throw away. And I think what is happening is Hannah Arendt's kind of point in the 1950s, which used the language of the kind of the Greek polis, and she talks about the public space. And I think that one of the interesting things that's happening is this dislocation that's going on between public space as this kind of symbol of the Greek agora, Trafalgar Square, is being disaggregated from the original intention of the idea of public space being a place of contention and debate. You know, what is the phrase? Wherever you go, you will be a polis. Think on, Mick. Wherever you go, you will be a polis. And I think that you know, obviously these kind of national institutions, and I think it's really important. I think Dennis was talking about it, that the relationship between the capital or cities and their relationship to a kind of hinterland or a suburb is going to be actually strengthened even if an understanding of a chain of relationships between suburban, rural, and ex-urban and urban is strengthened. I mean, part of the freedom of choice you have in living in a suburb is to go one way out to another suburb or into the countryside, but also into the city. There is another freedom, I think, which is unstated in the suburb, is the hidden cultural landscape of organizations of, as trivial as it may seem, the book club, the sports association, the membership organizations. The left-handed Agatha Christie club is just as likely to be in Surbiton as it is in Islington.
Austin, you're muted. Can I follow up on Tim? Can I follow up on Tim?
Is it a good gag?
Because Tim's made a great point, and thankfully used my Agatha Christie left-handed fan club. But Sir Robin Wales, who was mayor of Newham for a long time, and he wanted Newham to be a place where people work, rest, and stay, and that was his big comment. Because economic migrants would come to Newham and they would start working, and then they'd get a better job, and then they want to move out of Newham to a part of London that was, better. And, a lot of people said, what we need is to create better jobs in Newham. Well, it's not the job you need to create in Newham, it's the better neighborhood, it's the place. And so, London will always be this very transient place. If you find Kingston dull, my advice is don't live in Kingston, but there's a lot of people that like dull, and I'm not suggesting it is. Maybe when Austin moves away, but there's a lot of people that like dull, that like the quiet place, and that's the beauty of big cities, is they have neighborhoods that offer also an incredible range of living that people can choose from. So, you should be transient within the city as well as just sort of moving to one place and then assuming that the rest of the city is that place. And again, it is about these special interest groups and, pub nights with the Agatha Christie left-handed club, because that's what makes it life not dull. It's not Kingston, it's what you are choosing to engage with in the place that you're staying. Sorry, I've been rambling, but hopefully my point is kind of made.
It's okay. Far be it for me to reinforce Kingston's tourist agency again, but look, I got one final speaker from the audience before I bring the rest of the panel in, and I'll give Tim and Martin a final bite as well when we come back. So this is the final contribution from the floor. It's Jean Pascal or Jean Pascal.
Hi, it's Jean.
Jean.
Yeah, hopefully a very short question. I'm picking up on the points about the using cities as cultural destinations and for the arts. With the threat to the arts in the situation we're in, surely that undermines that strategy?
Oh, very good. It's short and punchy, I like it. Okay, ponder that question as well, and we can come back to anything else. Can I just take the panel, if you would, just to give your comments on what you've heard tonight and criticisms of each other, maybe, but also your kind of final rounding up remarks would be very, very useful. Can I start with Joel, please? We'll come down the panel as Joel, you there?
I think one of the big problems is always the notion of, no, everyone's not going to work at home. But if you go from 6% to 20%, it has a huge effect. The change in how people live, like for instance, yes, let's say if I live in what we would call here the Inland Empire, Riverside, 50 miles from Orange County, where there are a lot of jobs, you may have people who come in once a week during the lunchtime when it's easy to get in and out. I think there's going to be a lot of blending. I think our notion of suburbia has to change. This is in the United States. This is where the minorities are going in large numbers. The places have become more diverse. I would actually say in some cases, Manhattan is parts of Manhattan are really boring now. It's all chain stores. It's all the same kind of people. You know, I think Simon Cooper at the Guardian said New York and London are places where the 1% marry each other. Not exactly socially mobile. Whereas I think that the suburbs may be a place where that happens. The other thing on the innovation point, actually the studies will show you that the largest number of patents are created at fairly low density areas. So, you know, there are lots of ways that people can interact. They don't have to interact in a crowded London pub or on the subway. They can interact in a more socially distanced kind of environment. And I think one of the big challenges, just want to leave you with this, it's going to be very hard for cities like New York, which if you know American accents, you know that's where I'm from, that if you have in the city of New York social distancing, I don't know how your offices are going to function particularly well. I've already been told people I'm waiting 20 minutes to get on an elevator. I don't know how cities adjust to that. And I think if I were a city planner, I'd be worried more about that than anything else.
As is typical of these things, in the final roundup, Joel, you can have hit the nail on the head there in terms of, you know, the mayor of London talking about 15% ridership on the tubes is obviously going to have a tremendous effect on waiting 7 trains before you get on one. So yeah, these are going to have repercussions. Worthwhile kind of unpicking how they've arisen and how we deal with it. Okay, Joel, thank you very much for that. We have Vicki, if you're out there.
The subject of universities has come up, and just thinking about how this connects to the future of the city. I mean, I really hope that one of the things that will come out of all of this eventually is that we do start to address the relationship between universities and the city, and particularly the way that the sort of marketization of higher education has meant the sort of imbalance between UK and overseas students, and really the exploitation of international students and the exclusion of UK students. Where I teach at the RCA, this has happened to such an extent that something like 70% of the interior design course is Chinese students. And, you know, that's fascinating in itself and leads to lots of opportunities, but it's really only done you know, because that brings in the income, and I think it is a real problem that that universities are being run by this kind of globally mobile group of people that are completely disconnected from their locality. So somewhere like the RCA, really, it could be anywhere now. It doesn't have to be in London. It's an entirely international thing. The head of architecture spent the whole of lockdown in Melbourne, as far as I know. So and I think that one of the things that serves that sort of, I mean, obviously there are many universities that are really rooted in their locality and have a much better relationship with local kids and recruit from the local area and so on. But I think that this sort of the sort of global cities like London have become, you do wonder if their development and their political agenda is more to kind of escape a national accountability in a sense. So you get this sort of idea that the devolution of global cities and funding for London could end up being something that's really used for political ends to sort of thwart a national idea about national democracy. And I think that the urban renaissance agenda has been, in that sense, subverted towards much more of a sort of beautification of the city centre, a sort of erasing of anything unpredictable or characterful, to make it, to standardise public space and standardise cultural experience for a political agenda. And that's making it actually very dull, as some people have said. And, you know, I mean, the exciting thing about cities is their constant change, and the fact that, you know, there are opportunities arise where parts of the city are neglected or abandoned. But often in central London now, you feel like there are fewer and fewer of those sort of opportunities. So, you know, without wishing to see greater poverty and dereliction in the city, I think that inevitably there will be new things that emerge from this kind of situation.
Okay, thank you very much, Vicki. Martin, have a second bite. It's your final comments.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, just picking up on Joel's comment about New York, and people will be queuing up or lining up outside the skyscrapers to get in. You know, I do think this is a case of the temporary city. You know, I think we will get beyond this quickly, and these office spaces will end up being used as offices again. And what I wanted to say is I've lived in both London and New York, and people always ask me which is the best city, and what I always say is London. But they are both amazing world cities because they have incredible diversity. They have a long-term plan in place, which is being constantly reviewed and constantly updated. I think the cities that will emerge from the COVID crisis will be those that are thoughtful about how you build into the new normal, how you keep people moving, living, happy, eating, just enjoying and exploring the city as they can, and make it better than elsewhere. And to do that requires, you know, thoughtfulness. And I guess that's my last comment.
Very good. Thank you very much. Sylvia, you out there.
I think for me, the debate here, like it shouldn't be about like whether we should go for cities or suburbs, or whether we should go from work from the office to work from home. I think moving forward, the future would be more about like looking for a kind of typology, new typology of urban form to accommodate something in between cities and suburbs, work from home and work from the office. And hopefully this kind of new typology would keep the merits of cities, mainly the diversity, but also hopefully allow people to live more equal lives. And I think this typology, it shouldn't be kind of a singular typology, and hopefully in different geographical locations, we'll see different solutions. And as for the role of universities, I think, I don't know, maybe universities can work more with architectural practices, design firms, with the government, because I see the solution to this like COVID situation. It isn't just, it wouldn't be just an architectural solution. It would also involve policy. It would involve changes of behavior of people. So I guess collaboration of different institutions would be really important, and perhaps together working with the government, they can really initiate changes that could be like executed. Like we can see the construction or formation of these new kinds of typologies of urban form, let's say, that would lead to better lives of people.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. And finally, Tim, final remarks. Tim's gone away. Tim, are you out there? On mute.
I'm talking here in the UK. It's been great having the international parallels, but it's the condition I only really understand and really know that well. It's debatable whether modernism ever really engaged with the suburbs in the UK fully. And it seems as if a kind of idea of modernity in the suburbs kind of gave up around you could argue the date around the 1980s. And I think with this change in relationship, it would be amazing if this was an opportunity in which modernist planning and an embracing of modernity in terms of transport, multi-type, including cars, was actually to be erased. We're living through a period in which technology of cars is changing dramatically. We've touched on it briefly, but the idea that if we were to embrace this moment, I think at the UK it's a really vital moment. There's a last chance for us to actually do that, or we're left to a kind of world of glass towers in a city centre being converted badly into housing, and pseudo fishing villages designed from pattern books that Prince Charles has ticked his little tick over. So I do think it's a moment of great opportunity, but it's a moment in which I think conditioning towards a kind of romanticization of the urban core has to be questioned, has to be looked at, and some form of alternative embraced.
Good. Thank you very much indeed for that. Look, I just think it was it's an important discussion, and it's not really one that's being had out, which is why we're here, I hope. The UK government obviously isn't doing it, and I guess the US government isn't necessarily involved in kind of a real conscious planning conversation for the future. I know Martin points that out, but there's technical policy conversations, but then there's notions about what we need for the future, and I think that's not necessarily being discussed in the way that some of the panelists, many of the panelists have been talking about. And I think the second thing is that I think Vicki raised this thing about this discrepancy between creatives. Here I am in the architectural world, and we have this kind of wonderful working from home moment, while all the oiks go and build the very things that we've just been designing from home. So we lead this kind of quiet, insular, safe life, and we send the construction workers out to build the results of our labours, or lack of labours, as the case may be. And it's that that discrepancy which is formulating, I suppose, tension, but also there's an unworldliness to the conversation between some of those people who are leading the conversation, who are the creatives. So I think there's the public space conversation which we had about regulated space, how it's actually going to become more regulated, partly because of this 2 meter, 1.5 meter, whatever the current fad meter rule is now being brought in, that there will be this sense that public space isn't really public because it's going to have to be managed for everybody's safety. The healthy city, the scared city, is something which I kind of worry about. And then I think the point that Phil raised, this kind of point about the culture of the city being having antipathy towards the city, which is what I've just been talking about, that idea that we're now afraid of the city in some respects because of what density and what people bring, is disease and worry. That's the philosophical level. On the practical level, there is that idea that there is an economic collapse around the corner. So even when you, Tim, said that you think you said museums will always be there, will always be with us. In some respects, I don't think maybe they will. There's going to be a shakeout, dramatic shakeout, and whether that leads to empty buildings means that there will be a shakeout in cultural institutions and universities and all the rest of it, leading to shells of some cities. It's kind of the new Rust Belt in a non-industrial age, perhaps. So I just think there's a kind of a really interesting kind of metaphorical, political, philosophical conversation, which we just scratched the surface on, ladies and gentlemen. But how entertaining was that? From around the world, I'm going to unmute, or hopefully Alistair will unmute everyone, for a rousing, well-deserved round of applause from a distance.